welcome to Everyday Storytelling. How are you doing today? We are going to be reading the Bible. The Bible.
No, first we're going to be doing the
right here.
The entire Bible.
The entire Bible.
Beginning to end.
No, we're actually going to be reading. I don't even know what we're reading. So, but actually before that, we're doing the joke of the day. So, gotcha. But after we do the Bible, we are going to be doing this synopsis with Daddy. And then we are going to be reading Abracadabra.
Hinds feet on
All right, get out of here. Come on, joke of the day. All right, ready?
Places.
Go, 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 go. Oh, what do they need to do?
Hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell to never miss another video. My brother is kindly waiting. You can see his shadow. So,
Okay, so what do you call an exploding monkey?
I don't know. What do you call an exploding monkey?
A baboom.
A Are baboons monkeys or are they apes?
No, they're monkeys.
Are they?
These are monkeys.
No, that's not true.
No,
They're kind of
Monkeys, no, monkeys and apes are different. They have different characteristics. Like, for example, apes don't have tails. Monkeys have tails.
Yeah, but they're related. Stop, like...
All right, so how are you doing today? Hi, Jessica. Hi, Rebecca. Hi, two other people.
You're welcome.
And I'm going to move this in a little closer. So, we are finishing up 1 Peter today.
I
Whoa.
need a banana.
Okay, that's creepy. All right, so yes, so we are going to finish. That is too close. Oh, I'm sorry. All right, sorry about that. 5 people. Whoa, crazy. All right, finishing 1 Peter. This is the English Standard Version of the Bible, and here we go. So I exhort the elders among you as fellow elder and a witness of the suffering of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. Humility toward one another, for God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him, because he cares for you. Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same kinds of suffering were being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world. And after you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. To him be the dominion forever and ever. Amen. By Silvanus, a faithful brother, as I regard him, I have written briefly to you, exhorting and declaring that this is the true grace of God. Stand firm in it. She who is at Babylon, who is likewise chosen, sends you greetings, and so does Mark, my son. Greet one another with the kiss of love. Peace to all of you who are in Christ. And there is a reference right there to the Church of Babylon, even as early as the 1st century. And this is probably written in the 60s. So we're talking like a generation after the crucifixion. I did want to point out one thing real quickly. This, JJ, that's really a little weird. Sorry, it's distracting. So this book, if you remember, I don't know if you remember, but is written to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion, in a list of places where he mentions. But so these are people that are being exiled. These are people who are being persecuted against. And what does he say to them? He says, "Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. Resist him firm in your faith, knowing that the same kinds of suffering are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world." These are people that are being persecuted. They're actively being persecuted. They've already been exiled around the world. And he's telling them not to worry, not to stress out. God's got this. So there's some promise for us as well. So, Hinds feet on hind places. What did I say it wrong?
Hind places.
Oh, did I say hind places? My bad. That's sorry. Okay, so yeah, I've got a peanut gallery in my home, in case you didn't know. So chapter 5 was the encounter with pride. So pride came up, and much afraid was like, just, "Oh, you don't scare me. Just go away." Oh,
she fell for it, hook, line, and sinker.
wait, no, Kimberly's looking at me. She's glaring at me. I must have said it wrong. I'm not exactly sure what happened with pride, but there was something to do with pride, and then on the
Scooch.
something about the desert.
What? I'm sorry. I was. Look, here you guys are. Now it's gonna be me in a second. So
Told them you were baking.
I was baking, and I'm making strawberry cupcakes with strawberry frosting too. And I kind of have a headache, and it kind of helps a little when I bake. So what happened is she had an encounter with pride, not fried. Fried chicken.
She had an encounter with fried chicken.
She must have got a KFC.
You know,
Okay, wait.
yesterday
She-
we had Jesus chicken at church.
Okay.
So she had an encounter with pride, not fried chicken. And she was like, "Oh, look, my cousin. He's not completely ignoring me. Maybe I should walk up to him. That is a great idea." Obvious sarcasm is obvious. But it doesn't go well. And then when she after a while, she calls the shepherd over, and pride just like runs away. And then he's like, "The head shepherd, why did you go and fall for pride? Like, why did you fall for that?" And he said it very nicely, and she was like, "Yeah, sorry." So then they go up, and she realizes that when she touches her companion's hands, that it hurts more than it usually did. Like, it didn't exactly hurt her to touch them the first few times, but it didn't feel very pleasant. I mean, their names are Sorrow and Suffering, but...
What? You remember their names?
Oh, wow.
So, much afraid,
Stop the presses!
I just pressed you.
Dad, you're going bonkers. Too bonkers.
So then what
Nobody
happened
talks.
was she goes up, and then she sees this desert, and she has to go into the desert for a few days. and
And she loves the desert.
she
It is
doesn't like the
such
desert.
Her favorite place to go.
She doesn't like the desert. She's like, I'm supposed to go up there, not down there. Why am I going down? So she has a bit of stuff with that, and she goes over to she calls the head shepherd, and he says, yeah, everybody I've taken on this path has to go to the desert for a little while, and you'll come out better. So right now she's learning about stuff, like she learned something about how grain is ground, and then she learned a bunch of other things.
Something about a potter's wheel.
Yeah. And then she found a flower. This is how it happened. She saw this little drop of water, and then where the drops hit the ground, these flowers were blooming, and they said something to her. I remember it was important, but I forgot what they said. And I think that about wraps it up. I'm gonna put my headset back on, and I'm gonna hand it over to Dad.
Okay, so she definitely remembers a whole lot more of the story than I do. And which is ironic, of course. But the Stop the Presses comment, that was my Gonzo impression. And I've noticed that all the videos that JJ watches have screaming people in them. And so I thought that maybe it would make this video more appealing if it had some screaming people in it. So I did the Stop the Presses comment, which definitely checks the box on the screaming person. And also gets to fulfill my Gonzo impression. And I recommend that everybody watches Acceptance with Joy. I recommend that everyone watches The Great Muppet Caper, because that's where that quote came from. All right, so with all that having been said, now we're on chapter 7, On the Shores of Loneliness. After they walked together through the burning desert sands, then one day, quite unexpectedly, a path crossed the main track which they were following. This, said the shepherd quietly, is the path which you are now to follow. So they turned westward with the high places right behind their backs and came in a little while to the end of the desert. They found themselves on the shore of a great sea. It is now time for me to leave you, much afraid, he said, and to return to the mountains. Remember, even though you seem to be farther away than ever from the high places and from me, there is really no distance at all separating us. I can cross the desert sands as swiftly as I can leap from the high places to the valleys, and whenever you call for me, I shall come. This is the word I now leave with you. Believe it and practice it with joy. My sheep hear my voice, and they follow me. Whenever you are willing to obey me, much afraid, and to follow the path of my choice, you will always be able to hear and recognize my voice, and when you hear it, you must always obey. Remember also that it is always safe to obey my voice, even if it seems to call you to paths which look impossible or even crazy. On saying this, he blessed her and went from them, leaping and bounding over the desert toward the high places, which were now actually right behind her. Much afraid and her two companions walked along the shores of the great sea for many days, and at first it seemed to her that up till then she had never known real loneliness. The green valley, where all her friends and she had lived, as far away behind her. The green valley, where all her friends and she had lived, was far away behind her. I don't know why that didn't make sense the first time. Even the mountains were out of sight, and there seemed to be nothing in the whole wide world but the endless sandy desert on one side, and the endless sea moaning drearily on the other. Nothing grew there, neither tree nor shrub nor even grass, but the shores were scattered with broken driftwood and with great tangled masses of brown and shriveled seaweed. Nothing lived in the whole region save the seagulls wheeling and crying overhead, and the crabs scuttling across the sand in their burrows. At intervals, too, an icy wind came shrilling across the billows, stabbing sharp as a knife. In those days, Much Afraid never let go of the hands of her two companions, and it was amazing how swiftly they helped her along. Stranger still, perhaps, was the way in which Much Afraid walked, swifter and more upright than ever before, and with scarcely a limp, for something had happened in the wilderness which had left a mark upon her for the rest of her life. It was an inner and secret mark, and no one would have noticed any difference outwardly, but all the same a deep inner change had taken place which indicated a new stage in her life. She had been down into Egypt and had looked upon the grinding stones, the wheel and the furnace, and knew that they symbolized an experience which she herself must pass through. Somehow, incredible as it was, she, Much Afraid, had been enabled to accept the knowledge and to acquiesce in it, and she knew within herself that with that acceptance a gulf had opened between herself and her past life, even between her past life, a gulf which could never again be closed. She could look back across it to the green valley between the mountains and see herself there with the shepherd's workers feeding her little flock, cringing before her relatives and going to the pool morning and evening to keep tryst with the shepherd. But it was looking at somebody else together, and she said to herself, I was that woman, but am not that woman now. She did not understand how it happened, but what the shepherd had said had come to pass in herself. For those who go down into the furnace of Egypt and find there the flower of acceptance come up changed and with the stamp of royalty upon them. It is true that Much Afraid did not feel at all royal, and certainly did not as yet look it. Nevertheless, she had been stamped with the mark, and would never be the same again. Therefore, though she went with sorrow and suffering day after day along the shores of the great sea of loneliness, she did not go cringingly or complainingly. Indeed, gradually an impossible thing seemed to be happening. A new kind of joy was springing up in her heart, and she began to find herself noticing beauties in that landscape, of which until then she had been quite unconscious. Her heart often thrilled with an inner ecstasy when she caught sight of the sun shining on the wings of the wheeling seagulls, making them gleam as dazzlingly white as the snow on the peaks of the far-off high places. Even their wild, mournful cries and their moanings of the water stirred in her a sorrow which was strangely beautiful. She had the feeling that somehow, in the very far-off places, perhaps even far-off ages, there would be a meaning found to all sorrow and an answer too fair and wonderful to be as yet understood. Often, too, she found herself laughing aloud as she watched the antics of the funny little scuttling crabs. When the sun shone brightly as it did at times, even the gray, dreary sea was transformed into a thing of surpassing beauty, with the light gleaming on the curving green breakers and the foaming spray, and the horizon blue as a midnight sky. When the sun thus shone on the wild wastes of water, it seemed as though all their sorrows had been swallowed up in joy, and then she would whisper to herself, When he hath tried me, I shall come forth as gold. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. One day they came to a place on the shore where the high cliffs and great rocks scattered all about. In this place they were to rest for a time, and while their Much Afraid wandered off by herself. After climbing the cliff, she found herself looking down into a lonely little cove, completely enclosed on three sides by the cliffs, and with nothing in it but driftwood and stranded seaweed. The chief impression it made upon her was its emptiness. It seemed to lie there like an empty heart, watching and longing for the far-off tide which had receded to such a distance that it could never again return. When, however, drawn by an urge to revisit the lonely cove, much afraid, went back to the same spot some hours later, all was changed. The waves were now rushing forward with the strength of a high tide urging them onward. Looking over the edge of the cliff, she saw that the cove which had been so empty was now filled to the brim. Great waves, roaring and laughing together, were pouring themselves through the narrow inlet and were leaping against the sides, irresistibly taking possession of every empty niche and crevice. On seeing this transformation, she knelt down on the edge of the cliff and built her third altar. "Oh, my Lord," she cried, "I thank thee for leading me here. Behold me. Here I am, empty as was this little cove, but waiting thy time to be filled to the brim with the flood tide of love." Then she picked up a little piece of quartz and a crystal which was lying on the rocky cliff, and dropped it beside the other memorial stones in the little bag which she carried with her. It was only a short time after the building of that new altar that her enemies were all upon her again. Far away in the valley of humiliation, her relatives had been awaiting the return of Pride with his victim, but as time passed and he did not return, and Much Afraid did not reappear, it became obvious that he must have been unsuccessful in his undertaking, and it was too proud to admit it. They decided that reinforcements must be sent as soon as possible before Much Afraid could reach the really high places and be altogether beyond their reach. Spies were sent out who met Pride and brought back word that Much Afraid was nowhere on the mountains, but was far away on the shores of the Sea of Loneliness. She was going in quite a different direction from the mountains altogether. This was unexpectedly delightful and encouraging news, and quickly suggested to them the best reinforcements to be sent to the help of Pride. There was complete unanimity in deciding that resentment, bitterness, and self-pity should hurry off at once to assist in bringing back Much Afraid to her eagerly awaiting relatives. Off they went to the shores of loneliness, and Much Afraid now had to endure a time of really dreadful assaults. It is true that her enemies soon discovered that this was not the same Much Afraid with whom they had to deal. They could never get within close reach, because she kept so near to sorrow and suffering, and accepted their assistance so much more willingly than before. However, they kept appearing before her, shouting out their horrid suggestions and mocking her, until it really seemed that wherever she went, one or another popped up. There were so many hiding places for them among the rocks, and hurled their darts at her. "I told you so," Pride would shout viciously. "Where are you now, you little fool? Up on the high places? Not much. Do you know that everyone in the Valley of Humiliation knows about this, and is laughing at you? Seeking your heart's desire, eh? And left abandoned by him, just as I warned you, on the shores of loneliness. Why didn't you listen to me, you little fool?" Then resentment would raise his head over another rock. He was extremely ugly to look at, but this was a horribly fascinating ugliness. Sometimes Much Afraid could hardly turn her eyes away when he stared at her boldly and shouted, "You know, Much Afraid, you act like a blind idiot. Who is this shepherd you follow? What sort of a person is he to demand everything you have, and take everything you offer, and give nothing in return but suffering and sorrow, and ridicule and shame? Why do you let him treat you like this? Stand up for yourself and demand that he fulfill his promise and take you at once to the high places. If not, tell him that you feel absolved from all necessity to follow him any longer." Bitterness would then break in with his sneering voice. The more you yield to him, the more he will demand from you. He is cruel to you and takes advantage of your devotion. All he has demanded from you so far is nothing to what he will demand if you persist in following him. He lets his followers, yes, even women and children, go to concentration camps and torture chambers and hideous deaths of all kinds. Could you bear that, you little whiner? Then you'd better pull out and leave him before he demands the uttermost sacrifice of all. Sooner or later, he'll put you on a cross of some sort and abandon you to it. Self-pity would chime in next, and in some dreadful way he was almost worse than any of the others. He talked so softly, in such a pitying tone, that Much Afraid would feel weak all over. "Poor little Much Afraid," he would whisper. "It is too bad, you know. You really are so devoted, and you have refused him nothing, absolutely nothing. Yet this is the cruel way in which he treats you. Can you really believe when he acts toward you like this that he loves you and has your real good at heart? How can that be possible? You have every right to feel sorry for yourself, even if you are perfectly willing to suffer for his sake. At least other people ought to know about it and pity you instead of misunderstanding and ridiculing as they do. It really seems as though the one you follow takes delight in making you suffer and leaving you to be misunderstood. For every time you yield to him, he thinks up some new way of wounding and bruising you." That last remark of Self-Pity's was a mistake, because the word bruising suddenly reminded Much Afraid of what the shepherd had said when they stood together on the threshing floor in the pyramid. "Bread corn is bruised," he had said, "but no one threshes it forever, only till it is ready to be made bread for others. This also cometh forth from the Lord of hosts, who is wonderful in counsel and excellent in working." Isaiah 28:28 and 29. When she thought of this, to Self-Pity's dismayed astonishment, Much Afraid actually picked up a piece of rock and hurled it at him, and as he said afterward to the other three in an aggrieved tone of voice, "If I hadn't ducked and bolted like a hare, it could have laid me out altogether, the little vixen." But it is exhausting to be assaulted day after day with suggestions like these, and while sorrow and suffering were holding her hands, naturally Much Afraid could not cover her ears, so her enemies were really able to give her a dreadful time. At last things came to a crisis. One day, when her companions actually seemed to be sleeping for a little while, I skipped a page, sorry. Much Afraid unwarily wandered off alone, not this time to her favorite spot, looking down into the little cove, but in a new direction, and she came to a place where the cliffs joined out into the sea, forming a very narrow peninsula, which ended in a sheer precipice. When she reached the end of this promontory, she stood looking out over the endless expanse of sea, and suddenly found to her horror all four of her enemies approaching and closing in on her. That already she was becoming a different person was then quite apparent, for instead of nearly fainting with fright at their approach, although she did look very pale and frightened, she actually seized a stone in each hand and, putting her back against a great rock, prepared to resist them to the limit of her strength. Fortunately, the place was too narrow for all four to approach together, but Pride put himself in front of the others and stepped toward her, holding a strong cudgel. "You can put down those stones, Much Afraid," he said savagely. "There are four of us here, and we mean to do as we please with you now that you are in our power. You shall not only listen to us, but shall go with us." Much Afraid lifted her face toward the seemingly empty sky with all her strength and called out, Come to my deliverance, and make no tarrying, O my lord. To the horror of the 4 ruffians, there was the shepherd himself leaping toward them along the narrow promontory, more terrible than a great mountain stag with thrusting horns. Resentment, bitterness, and self-pity managed to hurl themselves flat on the ground and edge away as he bounded toward the place where Pride was just seizing hold of Much Afraid. Catching him by the shoulders, the shepherd spun him around, lifted him in the air, where he uttered a loud, despairing shriek, and then dropped him over the edge of the cliff into the sea. "Oh, shepherd," gasped Much Afraid, shaking with relief and hope. "Thank you. Do you think Pride is really dead at last?" "No," said the shepherd. "It is most unlikely." He glanced over the cliff as he spoke, and caught sight of Pride swimming like a fish toward the shore, and added, "There he goes, but he has had a fall today which he will not forget, and I fancy he will limp for some time to come. As for the other 3, they have made off into some hiding place, and are not likely to trouble you again in the same way, now that they realize that I am within a call." "Shepherd," asked Much Afraid earnestly, "tell me why I nearly got into Pride's clutches again, and why resentment, bitterness, and self-pity have been able to pester me for so long in this dreadful way. I did not call you before because they never dared to come close to me or to make a real attack, but they have been lurking around all the time and making their horrible suggestions, and I couldn't get away from them. Why was it?" "I think," said the shepherd gently, "that lately the way seemed a little easier, and the sun shone, and you came to a place where you could rest. You forgot for a while that you were my little handmaiden, Acceptance with Joy, and were beginning to tell yourself it really was time that I led you back to the mountains and up to the high places. When you wear the weed of impatience in your heart instead of the flower, Acceptance with Joy, you will always find your enemies get an advantage over you." Much Afraid blushed. She knew how right he was in this diagnosis. It had been easier to accept the hard path and to be patient when the sea was gray and dull than now when the sun shone and everything else around looked bright and happy and satisfied. She put her hand in her shepherd's and said sorrowfully, "You are quite right. I have been thinking that you are allowing me to follow this path too long, and that you were forgetting your promise." Then she added, looking steadfastly into his face, "But I do tell you now with all my heart that you are my shepherd, whose voice I love to hear and obey, and that it is my joy to follow you. You choose, my lord, and I will obey." The shepherd stooped down and picked up a stone which was lying beside her feet, and said smilingly, "Put this in your bag with the other stones, as a memorial of this day when for the first time you saw Pride toppled over before you, and of your promise that you will wait patiently until I give you your heart's desire." Chapter 8, On the Old Sea-Wall. A few days had passed after the victory over Pride, and Much Afraid and her companions were continuing their journey along the shore of the great sea. One morning, the path unexpectedly turned inland again, and they found themselves facing back over the desert in the direction of the mountains, although, of course, they were too far away to be visible. With a thrill of indescribable joy, Much Afraid saw that at last the path did actually run straight toward the east, and that it would lead them back to the high places. She dropped the hands of her 2 guides in order to clap her own, and gave a little skip of joy. No matter how great the distance between them and the mountains, now at last they were to go in the right direction. All 3 started back across the desert, but Much Afraid could not wait for her guides, and actually ran on ahead as though she had never been lame at all. Suddenly the path took another turn at right angles, and went straight before her as far as she could see, not toward the mountains at all, but southward again, to where far ahead the desert seemed to end in some sort of hill country. Much Afraid stood quite still, dumb with dismay and shock. Then she began to tremble all over. It could not be possible, no, it couldn't, that yet again the shepherd was saying no, and turning her right away from the high places. Hope deferred maketh the heart sick, said the wise man of long ago, and how truly he spoke. Now she had been skipping and running so excitedly along the path toward the mountains that she had left sorrow and suffering quite behind, and while they were catching up with her, she was standing quite alone at the place where the path turned away from the mountains. Up from behind a sand dune close beside her rose the form of her enemy, Bitterness. He did not come any nearer, having learned a little more prudence, and was not going to make her call for the shepherd if he could avoid it, but simply stood and looked at her and laughed again, the bitterest sound that Much Afraid had heard in all her life. Then he said, as venomously as a viper, "Why don't you laugh too, you little fool? You knew this would happen." There he stood, uttering these awful bursts of laughter, until it seemed that the whole desert was filled with the echoes of his mockery. Sorrow and her sister came up to Much Afraid and stood by her side quite silently, and for a little while everything was swallowed up in pain and a horror of great darkness. A sudden swirling wind shrieked over the desert, and raised a storm of dust and sand which blinded them. In the silence which succeeded the storm, Much Afraid heard her voice, low and trembling, but quite distinct, saying, "My lord, what dost thou want to say to me? Speak, for thy servant heareth." Next moment the shepherd was standing beside her. "Be of good cheer," he said. "It is I. Be not afraid. Build me another altar, and lay down your whole will as a burnt offering." Obediently, Much Afraid raised a little heap of sand and loose stones, which was all that she could find in the desert, and again laid down her will, and said with tears, for Sorrow had stepped forward and knelt beside her, "I delight to do thy will, O my God." From somewhere, though they could not see the source, there came a spurt of flame, which consumed the offering and left a little heap of ashes on the altar. Then came the shepherd's voice, "This further delay is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified." Another gust of wind sprang up and whirled the ashes away in every direction, and the only thing remaining on the altar was a rough, ordinary-looking stone, which Much Afraid picked up and put into the bag with the others. Then she rose to her feet, turned her face away from the mountains, and they all started southward. The shepherd went with them for a little way, so that Resentment and Self-Pity, who were hiding close at hand, awaiting an opportunity to attack, lay flat behind the sand dunes and were not seen at that time at all. Presently they reached a place where the sea, which they had left behind when they turned inland, came sweeping into the desert, forming a great estuary. A strong tide was surging into it, filling it completely with swiftly flowing waters. However, a stone causeway with many arches had been built across the estuary, and an earthen ramp led up to it. The shepherd led Much Afraid to the foot of the ramp, and told her to follow this path across the sea. Once more he repeated with great emphasis the words which he had spoken beside the altar, then departed. Much Afraid, followed by her two companions, scrambled up the ramp and found themselves on top of the old sea wall. From the height on which they now stood, they could look back over the desert. On one side was the sea, and on the other, so blurred with distance that they could not be sure if they really saw it, was a haze which might be part of the mountains, or was it only wishful thinking. Then, looking ahead, they saw that the causeway would indeed bring them across the estuary into a different kind of country altogether, a well-wooded land of hills and valleys with cottages and farmsteads among orchards and fields. The sun was shining brilliantly, and up there on the wall they could feel the full force of the great wind, which was urging and lashing the rushing waves to flow swifter and swifter. It reminded Much Afraid of a pack of hounds, urged on by the huntsmen, followed by one another, leaping and surging and roaring beneath their causeway, and then flowing forward far inland, brimming the shores of the estuary. Somehow the roar of the wind and the surge of the waters seemed to get into her blood and course through her being like the glorious wine of life. The wind whipped her cheeks and tore at her hair and clothes and nearly toppled her over, but she stood there, shouting at the top of her voice, though the wind seized the sound of it and carried it off, drowned in a deafening roar of its own. What Much Afraid was shouting up there on the old sea wall was this: "And now shall mine head be lifted up above mine enemies round about. Therefore I will sing praises unto the Lord. Yea, I will offer the sacrifice of joy, and will praise the name of the Lord." Psalm 27:6. As she sang, she thought to herself, it must really be dreadful to be the shepherd's enemies, always, always to find themselves frustrated, always, always to have their prey snatched away. How simply maddening it must be to see even the silliest little weaklings set up out of reach on the high places and made to triumph over all their enemies. It must be unbearable. While still on the causeway, she picked up another stone as the shepherd had taught her, this time as a memorial of his victory in making her triumph over her enemies, and dropped it into the little bag of treasured memories. So they made their way across the causeway and down the ramp on the other side, and immediately found themselves in a wood. The change in scene after their long journey through the desert was wonderful. A long-deferred spring was just loosening everything from the grip of winter, and all the trees were bursting into fairest green, and the buds were swelling. In between the trees were glades of bluebells and wild anemones, and violets and primroses grew in clumps along the mossy banks. Birds sang and called to one another and rustled about, busily absorbed in nest building. Much Afraid told herself that never before had she realized what the awakening from the death of winter was like. Perhaps it had needed the desert waste to open her eyes. It had needed to open her eyes to all this beauty, but she walked through the wood, almost forgetting for a little that Sorrow and her sister also walked with her. Everywhere she looked, it seemed that the unfurling green on the trees and the nesting birds and the leaping squirrels and blossoming flowers were all saying the same thing, greeting one another in their own special language with a sort of ecstasy, and calling cheerfully, "You see, the winter has gone at last. The delay was not unto death, but for the glory of God. Never was there a fairer spring than this." At the same time, Much Afraid herself was conscious of a wonderful stirring in her own heart, as though something were springing up and breaking into new life there, too. The feeling was so sweet, yet so mixed with pain, that she hardly knew which predominated. She thought of the seed of love which the shepherd had planted in her heart, and half afraid and half eager, she looked to see as if it had really taken root and was springing up. She saw a mass of leaves, and at the end of the stem a little swelling which might almost prove to be a bud. As Much Afraid looked at it, another stab went through her heart, for she remembered the words of the shepherd that when the plant of love was ready to bloom, she would be loved in return and would receive a new name up there on the high places. But here she was, still far away from them, indeed farther than ever before, and with apparently no possibility of going there for a long time to come. How could the shepherd's promise prove true? When When she thought of that, her tears fell again. You may think that Much Afraid was altogether too much given to shedding tears, but remember that she had Sorrow for a companion and teacher. There is this to be added, that her tears were all in secret, for no one but her enemies knew about this strange journey on which she had set out. The heart knoweth its own sorrow, and there are times when, like David, it is comforting to think that our tears are put in a bottle, and not one of them forgotten by the one who leads us in paths of sorrow. But she did not weep for long, for almost at once she caught sight of something else, a gleam of gold. Looking closer, what should she see but an exact replica of the little golden flower which she had found growing near the pyramids in the desert. Somehow it had been transplanted, and was actually growing in her own heart. Much Afraid gave a cry of delight, and the tiny golden thing nodded and said in its little golden voice, "Behold me, here I am, growing in your heart, acceptance with joy." Much Afraid smiled and answered, "Why, yes, of course, I was forgetting." And she knelt down there on the wood, put a pile of stones together, and laid sticks on them. As you have noticed, altars are built of whatever materials lie close at hand at the time. Then she hesitated. What should she lay on the altar this time? She looked at the tiny swelling on the plant of love, which might be a bud and again might not. Then she leaned forward, placing her heart on the altar, and said, "Behold me, here I am, thy little handmaiden, acceptance with joy, and all that is in my heart is thine." This time, though there came a flame of fire and burned up the sticks, the bud was still on the stem of the plant. Perhaps, thought Much Afraid, because it was too small to offer. But nevertheless, something lovely had happened. It was as though a spark from the flame had entered her heart, and was still glowing there, warm and radiant. On the altar, among the ashes, was yet another stone for her to pick up and put with the rest, so now there were 6 stones of remembrance lying in the bag she carried. Going on their way, in a very short time they came to the edge of the wood, and she uttered a cry of joy, for who should be standing there waiting to meet them but the shepherd himself? She ran toward him as though she had wings on her feet. "Oh, welcome, welcome, 1,000 times welcome," cried Much Afraid, tingling with joy from head to foot. "I am afraid there is nothing much in the garden of my heart as yet, shepherd, but all that there is yours to do with as you please." "I have come to bring you a message," said the shepherd. "You are to be ready, Much Afraid, for something new. This is the message. Now shalt thou see what I will do." Exodus 6:1. The color leapt into her eyes, and a shock of joy went through her, for she remembered the plant in her heart, and the promise that when it was ready to bloom, she would be up on the high places, and ready to enter the kingdom of love. "Oh, shepherd," she exclaimed, almost breathless with the thought, "do you mean that I am really to go to the high places at last? Really, at last?" She thought he nodded, but he did not answer at once, but stood looking at her with an expression she did not quite understand. "Do you mean it?" she repeated, catching his hand and looking up at him with almost incredulous joy. "Do you mean you soon will be taking me to the high places?" This time he answered, "Yes," and added with a strange smile, "Now shalt thou see what I will do." And that's the end of chapter 8. Chapter 9 is called The Great Precipice Injury. And the first word is after. And it looks like everybody's busy. Who says that we just keep going?
No, keep going.
No.
Go away.
We've got 2 to keep going.
No.
We've got 1 no.
Ready. We have school tomorrow.
We've got school tomorrow. So we're going to have to, and Daniel's got to be up early. And actually, I've got to be up early, too, because I have to be at work at 5 o'clock. Yay! So, that's where we're going to stop it. Remember, the great precipice injury, and the first word is after. That is chapter 9. And JJ's going to show us his
Putty creation.
putty creation that he has made. I'm not sure what this is. Some kind of finger puppet.
It's an Among Us dude.
Among Us dude.
He's got an ice cream cone.
I really don't understand the
Tried
fascination
to
with
make
Among
it-
Us, but it
I
keeps
tried to
him
make a banana.
it keeps him occupied.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
okay.
It's very big in the culture right now.
So
And then if he wants to go super
Pride
fast,
can go jump in a river. Good idea. Throw rocks at self-pity. Good. Good one. All right. So, wait. JJ needs to keep that finger out of his nose. Oh, he just ate it. Just joking. All right.
All right.
So, we've had enough crazy for tonight. I'm going to go and,
guys,
what are we doing? That's enough crazy for
R.I.P.
tonight.
he died.
Okay, so we need to have another time on the we'll call it the art exhibit. So all right, everyone have a good night. We'll see you tomorrow. God bless.
Okay, we love you guys.
Bye. Daniel says we love you. We love you. Bye.